Hello friends and welcome to the 1st of July. It's the beginning of the end of the year. Obviously this time of month a lot of people are putting up their reading wrap-ups for the month of June, putting up their TBRs for the month of July. But if you've been around here for the last few months, you'll know that due to my injury and subsequent mental health stuff, I haven't been reading a whole lot. However, in the month of June, I did start reading a little bit again. Not a lot, but a little bit. And although I'm chuffed about that, it does mean I don't have, like 20 books to tell you all the stats and stuff about. And on top of that, although I do have a few plans for reading in July, I don't want to put too much pressure and expectation on myself. So again, we've just got a couple of things to talk about. So I thought we could kind of merge those two videos together and just do a little like reading check-in. So I've got my cup of tea ready. I hope you've got yours. Let's start talking about some books. Okay, I had them in totally the wrong order, but I think we're good now. So let's start with the books that I did read last month. And I finished six books. To be fair, they are all middle grade, but I mean, I'll take it. I'll take whatever I can get at this point. So the first one that I read was So That Happened, but maybe you already knew that, by Tami Sussman. This is a sweet contemporary story about 12-year-old Natalie, whose nickname is Nutty because she loves Nutella so much. And this book takes place in the year leading up to her bat mitzvah. So lots of themes of kind of becoming an adult, becoming a woman, what that even means, but also some strong themes explored around friendship, loyalty, and family. I liked a lot about this. I mean, the Jewish representation was very present and very strong throughout, which was amazing to see. I liked the small kind of like everyday moments with Natalie and her family, or Natalie and her grandmother, learning more about her grandmother's history. However, there were a few lines throughout that just I wish had been kind of approached differently. One was actually like right at the beginning of the book on the second or third page, where like just casually, it wasn't even necessary for the story, someone's talking about like a Canadian. Hang on, let me just find it. Yeah, it's something about the way that a Canadian that they know communicates. Maybe it's a Canadian thing, Mum said a few weeks ago. I told Mum that her comment was racist, but Mum claimed it wasn't technically racist because Jeff is white and Canada isn't a race, it's a multicultural country. That means the people who live there immigrated from different places around the world. And like, all of that is fine up until that last sentence. Because no, Canada isn't a race. It is a multicultural country. But not every person that lives in Canada immigrated there. Like, to me, that was just some really casual, unthoughtful Indigenous erasure. And for it to be on the second page of the book, it did kind of put me off on the wrong foot. Another example would be that throughout the book there's this boy who's kind of mean to Natalie, and at one point he literally snaps her bra strap, which to me is just like assault, but it's played off as kind of funny. And at one point one of the adults literally says something about how boys are often mean to girls they like. So those are a couple of examples of just a few things sprinkled throughout that weren't my favorite. There's also a situation with a friend who Natalie treats really quite badly, and the resolution to that friendship, it felt a bit too convenient for me and a little bit too like on Natalie's side. I don't think the consequences for Natalie's actions were really kind of explored. Everything was just like neatly wrapped up in a bow. And especially when the friend that she had wronged while they were, questioning their gender identity. And Natalie essentially abandoned them for like a good part of the year. And I thought that this book was leading up to like quite a strong reckoning with the transphobia that Natalie and the people around her were displaying. But instead it was all just kind of quietly smoothed over. So that was a little disappointing. Having said all that, this was an enjoyable read. I really liked the character of Natalie. I thought the voice was really strong and the Jewish rep was great. I need to remember to drink my tea rather than like talking about books for an hour and then having a cold tea, which is what I usually do. Okay, next up we've got Philomella and the Impossible Forest by Doris Brett. I think this is also by a Jewish author actually, although that representation isn't, explicit in the book. This is a fantasy adventure, and it's quite cute. I think this probably has my favorite cover of the books that I read this month, and it is definitely the longest. The setup for this is that Philomella, who I always called Philomena in my head while I was reading. Anyway, she's a young girl who kind of just like accidentally finds herself in this magical realm. It kind of happens quite quickly. It's kind of like a portal fantasy, I suppose. And she ends up in this impossible forest that has like talking trees and all this like kind of magical stuff going on. And essentially one of the big main trees tells Philomella that she has been chosen to help save the forest. There's some dark, terrible things happening. Rapunzel's gone missing. The tree does give her a few little sidekicks to help her out. And so they set out on this adventure through the impossible forest to figure out where Rapunzel is, what this dark, strange thing happening is, and to stop it taking over the impossible forest. I really, really liked a lot about this. The setup was great. The writing I really enjoyed. I found it very readable. And although I would happily recommend this book to kids looking for a kind of like fairly low stakes fun fantasy adventure. Not that Losing the Forest is low stakes, but it never feels too stressful. I didn't personally love it as much as I was hoping to, and primarily that is because everything is just very convenient throughout this book. It kind of felt like after we got the initial setup, every chapter had its own little trial or conflict, almost as if each chapter could have been like a mini episode or something of a TV show. And every single one of these trials or challenges was overcome pretty quickly and pretty easily by Philomella, which I think is why the stakes felt pretty low. So yeah, it was fun, it was sweet, but I thought I was gonna love it, and I just liked it, which is it's not terrible. Next we've got The Sideways Orbit of Avheart. I really like this cover too, actually. This is another contemporary, and it's quite a slow story, so I don't know that every middle grade reader would fall in love with it, but I'm certain that there definitely are a handful of middle grade readers who would just adore it. In this book, we're following the young Evie, who is such a sweet protagonist. She's one of those girls who really likes rules and likes structure and likes things to be a certain way. She does not like change. She finds it really challenging, which is why she has such a hard time throughout this novel when she finds out that her stepfather, who's really the only father she's ever known, is leaving. He and her mother are getting a divorce, and he's leaving to go to a different city for a job. So it's something that we learn kind of early in the book, but we know that he's not leaving for a few weeks. So this book kind of follows those few weeks in Evie's life while she's kind of coming to terms with what this change is going to mean for her and how she's going to cope with it. Her mother is a writer. Specifically, she writes the horoscopes. And on top of that, Evie's class at school is learning all about space. So there are plenty of space metaphors and analogies throughout. Basically, because this is such a prevalent theme in Evie's life at this time, she's kind of looking through that lens at all of her experiences. So I think this would be an incredible book for the more quiet, introspective kids, especially if they love space. The fourth middle grade book that I read is another contemporary, and this one's quite a short book. It's Sea Glass by Rebecca Fraser. This is barely 100 pages, and honestly, it made me tear up. I really liked this a lot. Again, this is a smaller, kind of quieter, slower contemporary story. In this, we meet a young girl named Caitlin who lives with her single mum. We find out that her father died when she was quite young. Her mother's been struggling to find work, and she's managed to pick up a 3-month contract in Geelong, which is about an hour away from Melbourne. And so over the Christmas holidays for these 3 months, Caitlin and her mum go to stay with Caitlin's grandfather in Geelong. That's her father's father, and she hasn't seen him since she was really little. She doesn't really know him. And quite quickly we learn that he is a really kind of sweet, quiet man who clearly has been borderline broken by the loss of his son. And basically the majority of this 100 pages is just watching a relationship form, a grandfather and granddaughter relationship form between these two. Like I said, the grandfather's a pretty quiet man, but one thing he loves to do is to walk along the beach and find sea glass. He's a big collector. He has jars and jars of it. And so he and Caitlin start doing that together. There's some other stuff that happens too, but honestly, that's the gist of it. It's just watching these two kind of form a bond, and it's just beautiful. I'm gonna tear up thinking about it. And it definitely made me miss my pop and wish I had gone sea glass collecting with him along the beach in Bateman's Bay. Okay, next we have a book that is actually a sequel in the series, but you don't need to read the books in order. That's The Eerie Excavation by Ash Harrier, and it's book 2 in the Alice England mysteries. This was so fun. I really liked it. I think this is some of the strongest writing of the books that I read this month. There is some very light, casual disability rep, but it's not a main part of the story. But basically we meet these 3 friends, Alice, Violet and Cal, who clearly developed a relationship in the book prior to this. Alice lives and works in her family's funeral home. Her family runs a funeral home. And so a lot of the kids at school think she's a bit freaky. And she also has this kind of magical gift where she can sometimes, not always, but sometimes she can hold on to an object that is near a dead body and it will offer her its story. She calls these objects resonant. So she got a little bit of a psychic power, I guess. Anyway, over the school holidays, her friends are kind of arguing about what they're going to get up to when Alice informs them that she has already organised, checked with their parents and everything, for them to attend an archaeology camp about an hour away at this haunted mansion. There's stories of lots of witchcraft and feuding families in the area, and so the head archaeologist is convinced that they're going to find some incredible artifacts of witchcraft from hundreds of years ago. And Alice is just fascinated by this. Her friends are less keen, but they eventually relent, and so they head off together. And basically, once they get to the mansion and they start excavating, things are just not quite as they seem. Clearly some people are being dishonest. They learn more about the feud between the families in the area and how maybe it's still ongoing. And during the excavation, a skeleton is uncovered. I don't know, I just thought this was a perfect balance of mystery, a little bit spooky, fun and funny, and I really liked the characters, all three of them, but especially Alice. She definitely kind of steps into a detective role throughout, and it was just really fun to watch her do her thing and to learn more about the history of this place and what was going on. I liked this one so much that we are going to talk more about the series in just a minute. But before we get there, I got to talk about the last middle grade that I read this month, which was also a sequel that I had not read the first book to, and I don't think you need to. It's Huda Was Here. This is by Hayek, and their first book was Huda and Me, which I've seen around so much and I've always wanted to read, but just never got around to. And I loved this. This was so good. In this, we follow our narrator, Akil, who I think is like a 12-year-old boy, and he's a pretty sweet kind of boy. So even though he is the narrator, it feels like our main character is his little sister Huda, who is just a menace. I love her. She has so much personality. It's just like literally popping off the page. I mean, Akil's great too, but Huda is just one of those characters that you will never forget. Anyway, in this, it's so great. We get to meet their very large Muslim Australian family, but sadly we find out that their father was recently fired from his security job. He was a security officer kind of patrolling their neighborhood at night to keep everybody safe. But at the beginning of the book, we're told that there's no more crime, and so he's not needed and he's fired, and it's really sad. So the family really struggle for a little while before eventually he manages to get a job that's kind of fly in, fly out, which means he's going to be away from home for months at a time. And this family are very close. They adore their father, and Huda and Akil in particular just kind of can't imagine life without their dad. And so Huda concocts this plan for she and Akil to start basically roaming the streets at night, causing mischief, like to convince everybody that they need to hire their dad back. And although they do get up to some things that they really shouldn't be doing, it's kind of hilarious the ways in which they do them. For example, I'll give you a little sneak peek. Early on, one of the things that they decide to do is to graffiti, but they do it with chalk because they're sweet kids, you know, like they're going to break the law, but only a little bit. Although, to be fair, there is one thing in here that they do that I do feel like crosses a pretty strong boundary. And I think like they obviously realize that too. So it's not just like a horrible story about kids breaking the rules. Like they are grappling with their morality and wrong and right throughout. Anyway, this was just such a great read. I loved it, and I definitely will have to read the first book at some point because yeah, it was great. Now, the book that I am pretty sure I'm about to DNF is a book that I honestly, I feel like you're all going to look at me and be like, serves you right, serves you right. And it's actually the reason I painted my nails this color, because I was going to do like a whole reading vlog. And that book is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. Now, if you're new here and you don't know why I'm laughing, I'll leave a link in the cards above to your answer to that. Basically, I've read several of Brandon Sanderson's books before, and I did a vlog for each of the first 3 books in the Mistborn series. And the last 2 are rant reviews. I hated them. They were both in my top 3 worst books of last year. And in the final book, I declared that I was never going to read another Brandon Sanderson book in my life. I'm clearly a big fat liar. Look, in my defense, when people started talking about Tress being like this really delightful, whimsical, almost fairy tale-esque story, I even heard that it had this really playful kind of narration. All of these things are my buzzwords. Like, if ever there was going to be a Brandon Sanderson book that was for me, it was going to be this one. And on top of that, the reason I decided to read it now is because of the fact that I've been struggling to read so much. And I was really happy that I'd managed to read 6 middle grades, but I knew at some point I needed to start reading adult books again. And one of the things that I did enjoy about my experience of reading Brandon Sanderson was just how easy he is to read. Like, I picked up a 500, 600, 700 page book and I read it quickly and easily. And so I just kind of thought that, you know, like this is actually a pretty short book for him. I kind of thought that it would just be a good boost to my confidence, you know, pumping this out and hopefully really enjoying it. And in fairness, it has been a pretty quick, easy read. I got up to page 122, so I was about to start chapter 23. And I know you're waiting for me to start yelling about how mad I am about this book. I'm not mad. I'm just kind of bored. I kind of like the world with the sea made of spores. I kind of like Tress. I kind of like that she's gone on this adventure to save her prince rather than the other way around. But I suppose that's the point. I just kind of like it. I don't love any of the characters. I don't love the narration in the way that I thought I would. I'm usually a sucker for playful narration or unusual narrators. This one, I mean, it's just reeking of dad boomer humor. And I think at the end of the day, what I'm realizing more and more is that I didn't just dislike Mistborn because of the things that I had a problem with, like the things that I thought were outright problematic. I do think those books are problematic, and I'm still mad that BookTube's not talking about that. But even more than that, something that is like irredeemable, essentially, with an author is the actual writing style. Brandon Sanderson is just a very clear, direct author, and he just kind of tells you everything. And I think what I've realized more and more is that I am not a very visual reader. I don't have like some very strong mind's eye where I imagine the scene. I'm someone who just like feels the scene. And Brandon Sanderson is not an author who elicits feelings in me. At the beginning, we learned that Tress is in love with Charlie, and so when he disappears, she goes off to save him. But like the few interactions that we had between them, they didn't feel passionate. They didn't feel full of love. They didn't feel full of desire. We were just told that Charlie likes to tell stories and Tress listens to them. And so they love each other. Like, we were just told. But because I didn't feel it, I didn't feel that they loved each other, I wasn't invested in this whole journey. And I was looking forward to making a video because I thought either I would end up hating it, and I mean, it's just kind of funny to watch somebody read a book that they hate and like get mad about it on camera every now and then, or I would love it. And I love talking about books that I love, and I thought that that would be such a cool like redemption moment, you know, after the journey I've been on with Brandon Sanderson. But instead, I'm just kind of falling flatly in the middle. And like, that's not interesting to you. It's not interesting to me as a reader. And at the end of the day, I just kept thinking that I would so much rather be reading something else. This book feels like karma. This feels like Universal Publishing karma coming at me. I know Brandon Sanderson isn't an author for me. I said I would never read another book. And so I feel like this is just a big, big lesson. I need to stop buying into the hype. I need to stop making exceptions. I need to stop wishing that I could be a part of the Brandon Sanderson hype train, because it's not for me. I don't have an invitation. I just need to see myself out. So that is everything that I read in the month of June. Not too shabby for someone who hasn't really read anything for the past few months. And this would be like the order in which I've enjoyed them. Anyway, let's move swiftly on to my plans for my reading in July. Like I said, this is not going to be too structured. I'm not going to hold myself to this too strongly. I don't want to put too much pressure on myself now that I'm finally starting to get a bit of momentum with my reading. But there are a couple of categories of things that I would like to try to get to in the month of July. The first is actually a non-fiction, and it is The Hate Race by Maxine Beneba Clarke. This was actually the book voted for, I think, March for my Blossom Book Club over on my Patreon. And obviously I haven't gotten to it because I wasn't reading for like 3 or 4 months straight. But it is a book that's been on my shelf for so long because I've been wanting it to win the Patreon vote. And then of course the month that it does, I have a mental health crisis. Anyway, I've been desperate to read this for so long. I need to get to it, and I want to pick up the book club again. And I'm hoping that we can start to do that in July. Basically, this is a memoir of one of my favorite authors. Maxine mostly writes poetry, but she's also written some short stories, and she's written my favorite short story collection of all time, which is Foreign Soil. I've also read some of her other nonfiction, especially like her essays, but this one obviously is a lot more personal, so I've been really looking forward to it. Let's hope that I can finally get to it in July. Next up, we've got The Golem and the Djinni. I set out this year to read 10 of my big books, and this is a big book. And basically the idea was that each month my patrons would vote on which big book I was going to read the following month, and I would do a reading vlog for them. I got 2 books into that challenge, and as we've already established, had a mental health crisis. So in March, I did not get to the book that was voted on. And obviously now that I'm starting to feel a little bit better, my life is starting to look a little bit more normal, whatever that means again, I would like to get to this and finally get that reading vlog up. Obviously, it is a big, intimidating book, so I mean, I'm not going to put too much pressure on myself to get it done immediately, but it is something that I do want to try and prioritize in the coming month or so. I don't know a whole lot about this other than that I've heard really good things, and I think it's an historical fantasy and kind of reads a bit like a fairy tale. And it is over 600 pages long, so it's pretty chunky. When I first bought this, I did think that it was a standalone, but turns out it's not. I don't know if the second book is already out, but it's definitely on its way if it's not. I'm really hopeful that I like this because the other 2 big books that I've read so far this year for this challenge, I did not like either of them, but hopefully third time's a charm. The next lot of things that I want to read are not so much specifically these books, but more like a category of books that I want to read more of, and that is just middle grade and young adult books. And that's because we have tentative plans of me returning to work in July. For those of you who don't know, I'm a children's bookseller and I've been off work for 6 months with a pretty severe injury, and so I'm very much out of the loop with new releases. And so I have a few proofs of new releases here that I would like to get to, and of course I have plenty of other middle grade books that I haven't yet read on my shelf. But the three that I'm thinking I would like to prioritize are Sunshine on Vinegar Street by Karen Comer. I think this is the author of a YA book, Grace Notes, that came out this year as well. Was it Grace Notes, or am I making that up? Anyway, this is a book partly written in verse, which is something I tend to really enjoy. So I'm looking forward to this. Then we've got Meet Me at the Moon by Shivaun Plozza, and this looks like it's going to be a really pretty cover. The reason that I picked this proof up in particular is because it's blurbed by Shirley Ma. She's the author of All Four Quarters of the Moon and A Glass House of Stars, which are two of my favorite middle grades. And she says, magical, this book will make you believe moon trees are everywhere, but it is also deeply grounded and full of real heart. I loved it. Apparently it's a warm-hearted story about believing in the unbelievable and finding comfort in the places where science and magic overlap. I'm really looking forward to this. I think it'll be sweet. Then something that looks a little bit more fun is Ruby and the Pen by David Lawrence. And this one actually has quite a lot of illustrations throughout. And I think this is a little bit of a fantasy one as well, but more like funny, playful. Ruby's life sucks. She hates her mother's dodgy boyfriend and now she's being sent away to boarding school. Creating funny cartoons is the only thing that makes her smile, until she buys a magical pen at a mysterious market store. Now, whatever Ruby draws comes true. So I think this is going to be a fun read. I'm looking forward to it. Then a book that I started last night, so I will be reading and hopefully finishing in July, is The Deadly Daylight by Ash Harrier. This is the first book in the Alice England mysteries. So it's the first book to the book that I read this month and really enjoyed. Like I said, I'm already halfway through and I'm loving it. We learn a lot more about Alice and her life and work in the funeral home. We see her gift of, touching an object and hearing its story a little bit more in this one. We also learn a little bit more about Violet in particular. She has like a deathly allergy to the sun. We've also learned that Alice was actually a twin. Her twin died when they were born, and Alice has a disability with her leg. It was kind of like caught in the umbilical cord when they were born. We're just starting to get to know Cal, so I don't know a lot about him yet, but he seems to be running in some not so good groups. And the three of them are brought together because of a mystery. Violet, the girl who's allergic to the sun, a lot of her family are also allergic to the sun, including her uncle. And the police immediately said it was because of his allergy that he died, that he didn't know the sun was coming up or something. But the three of them just aren't quite sure that that's a good enough explanation. And so they're trying to figure out what else might have happened to Violet's uncle. Again, the writing in this is just great. I love the characters and I'm just having so much fun. I like that there is a bit of darkness here. Like there is kind of like a constant discussion of death. Obviously Alice works in the funeral home and so we watch her kind of work at several funerals, but it never does it in kind of like a really morbid way. It just does it in kind of like a casual, matter-of-fact way. And I think at one point Alice even comments on the fact that, sometimes families don't bring children to funerals because they feel like children shouldn't learn about death, where she feels like it's just a part of everyday life. It's just a part of being a human and it's natural. So why shouldn't children be exposed to it? Anyway, like I said, you don't have to read them in any order, but I'm glad I'm now reading this first one because you definitely do just get to know the characters a little bit more. And I'm loving it. I'm absolutely loving this series so much. I think it might be a new favorite for me actually. Anyway, that's a nice little wrap up of the books that I have read in the last month and the books that I hope to read in the coming month. I hope you enjoyed this little check-in. I would love to hear in the comments down below what you've been reading or what you plan to read. A big thank you as well to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially a big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown and Marie. I'll talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.